meeting has begun.
Good morning, everyone. This is Carrie Kosach from National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. I will be helping you facilitate today's webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to provide a brief overview of how our webinar system will work and how you can interact with the presenters. If everyone has their full name, and it looks like they do, and there's actually two phone numbers that are showing up, starting with 301 and the other one starting with 804. We'd like to know who those numbers are for. So if you wouldn't mind selecting that number and dragging it to your name, that would be great. You can also type in the chat box of who that number belongs to.
And we can do it for you.
We will be utilizing the hand raising of the Adobe Connect during this webinar. This will allow you to participate during the webinar. If you wish to offer a comment or ask a question, all you will need to do is hover over the person image on your at the top of the screen and select the down drop, and the very first option is raise hand. On the left-hand side of the screen, you will see a list of materials. It's actually the focus group webinar. You'll be able to download that. To download, simply select the file that you'd like to download. In the new browser, a new browser window will open and confirm that you wish to download. Once you confirm, the download will begin. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a chat box. This will allow you to chat with everyone. However, you can chat privately with other people. To do that, you can hover over that person's name, and once you do that, you'll see on the left-hand side, it will say Start Private Chat, and you'll be able to chat privately with that person. If you're having any difficulties, technical difficulties, your internet connection might drop from the webinar. If this occurs, please be patient with Adobe Connect. It will automatically reconnect you. If you have joined by phone, there will be no interruption to audio. And if you have any other technical difficulties, please just private message me, and I will help alleviate any issues that you may be having. Thank you for your attention while I explain the webinar system. If you have any questions, please feel free to private message me. I'd like to now turn it over to Erin Branch from National Council.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone. This is Erin Branch with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. I'm a program director here, and I want to just affirm for everyone that you're in the right place. We're here to talk about focus groups within the context of the Linking Systems of Care project. And I wanted to sort of affirm for everyone that we are among friends. Actually sitting at the table with me are Kelly, Michelle, and Carlene, who many of you know and speak with frequently about your technical assistance needs. And in fact, I think it was a request from several people from both of the sites to talk a little bit more about focus groups, and that's what gave rise to this webinar. Just there was enough common interest that we thought both sites would benefit from it. The reason I say you're among friends is that we actually are going to be asking frequently throughout this webinar that you all use the chat function at the bottom of the screen to provide us some feedback, some questions, some comments about your experiences so that we can make sure we're in conversation and not just talking at you. And I want to affirm for you also that when we talk about focus groups, we are thinking about that broadly, not just focus groups. We're talking about any time in which you are listening to the people in your communities that you hope to serve through this project. And when we get into the meat of this conversation, I hope you know that if we use the word focus group, we may well be meaning a listening session or a stakeholder group or things like that, and we will unpack all of those sorts of things as we proceed. And I think, at least that when I speak for the council, that when we talk about linking systems of care and creating healing communities, that we believe so strongly that this starts with listening to the communities we hope to serve, and so that's one of the reasons we think this topic is so important. The last thing I'll say before we actually get going is that at the end of this webinar, we will have a survey that pops up. So when Kelly or I say goodbye and thank you, please hang out with us for just one more minute while we try to get your best thinking. We take these surveys really seriously because we want to make sure training and technical assistance are helpful and direct and useful. So with that, I want to mention the folks that are on the line, not just the folks that are in the room with me. So we have on the line, Erin Branch, that's me, Kelly Ranasinghe is with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges also, and Kelly will be doing much of the presentation today because he did much of the research and is very experienced in this area. We also have our friends from OVC and ICF who are here to learn with us, provide perhaps some context, and will certainly contribute with comments and questions if anything arises, and they can answer your questions if things come up that are more particular to their expertise. And then we have folks from Montana and Virginia, and we're so glad that you're here. So, so thanks, everyone, and let's do our best to make this a conversation as well as a learning opportunity. And with that, I think I'm going to hand it off to Kelly to tell us what we're up to today.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. This is Kelly Ranasinghe from the National Council. So the first thing we're going to do is go over some of the learning objectives for this webinar. What we're going to do is you're going to be better able to describe what a focus group is, predict what key characteristics you'll have or need in your own focus group or listening session. You're going to recognize situations where focus groups have been used successfully by different organizations and why focus groups are used with specific populations, and also analyze what makes focus groups effective research tools. You're also going to be able to identify barriers to facilitation and delivery of focus groups, examine context-based analysis of participant responses, recognize the importance of cultural responsiveness and sensitivity in focus group delivery. So the first thing we're going to discuss is actually a question of semantics. Do we call it a focus group, a listening session, or a large group discussion, which is sort of what Erin alluded to. And in terms of our interaction with community, labeling and the semantics of power are actually something we don't really pay enough attention to. So there are strategic reasons for calling what is essentially a facilitated investigation and research discussion different things. And when we do this sort of work, we're always mindful that in our line of work, we work with vulnerable populations, sometimes historically oppressed populations, and language, particularly the language and communication of service-providing entities, government agencies, and even the law itself, is a source of power and elicits its own reaction. So, for instance, the term listening session tends to be much less confrontational than the idea of calling a meeting and summoning people. So listening connotes the fact that you're providing some level of power to the participants in the meeting. But basically, the strategies we're going to discuss all have fairly broad application. Although semantically the idea of group mapping exercises conveys something very different from a listening session, the substantive form of all of these activities kind of overlap with each other. And at some level, all of these discussions, like a focus group, a listening session, a moderated panel, a small and large group discussion, all are going to involve multiple people in a facilitated environment. And all of these exercises have their own unique benefits. And for instance, in NJIDV, when we train judges on national curriculum, we move from facilitated large group discussions to small groups to mini lectures back to large groups. And we do that so that the participant is constantly having to refocus his attention. On the other hand, if you think about some of the juvenile trainings we do, we use a lot of panels, particularly in our Trafficking Institute, because we tend to convey a lot of information in a short span of time. So when you're thinking about these things, there are uses for a variety of these activities in different environments, and we're going to try and touch on a variety of things.
So I thought we might start, and this is where I would encourage you to use the chat session, by asking those of you who've started your work to talk to us about some of the challenges that you've had. And I would like to just open it up to our friends in Montana, because you've started some of the work and done some of your focus groups. If you could visit with us a little bit about the kinds of challenges you've encountered with your focus groups. And you can just chat right into the box at the bottom, and everyone should be able to see it, although I will repeat questions or comments. And I think we all hope to learn from one another, so the challenges you've encountered may be helpful to folks in Virginia when they start planning similar things. I see that Nikki is typing. Thanks, Nikki. So Nikki writes that she thinks her biggest challenge was finding a representative group of service providers to invite. I think that's a real, yeah, it is rough, but I think it's just, spot on, because if you're going to be listening to your community, you want to make sure that you're listening to the entire community, not just the community you've worked with or the community you're most familiar with or perhaps the community you're most comfortable with. And Nikki, I wonder if you could tell us what kinds of strategies you've used to make sure that you were comprehensive in your outreach, or anybody on the line actually, including our folks from Virginia or our federal partners, if they have thoughts about strategies you can use to make sure you have the right people in the room.
And while Nikki is typing, I'd also mention that because so much of the information is coming from line workers, especially in Montana's resource identification analysis, it can be hard sometimes to get your line workers, like line social workers, line supervisors, public defenders, court officers, to take that much time out of their day to come to a focus group. So it has been a big challenge, and Nikki's been doing such a wonderful job out there in Montana. We had the chance to go and observe one of her focus group sessions and facilitations, which we thought was absolutely wonderful.
But it is a grind, and sometimes I know some people meet this strategic challenge by having multiple focus groups.
Yeah.
And so you might be listening, where you go to the welfare office, you go to the Head Start office, you go to the, the public library at different hours where it is easier. On the other hand, something's lost in terms of the interplay. So Nikki writes, not knowing each community, I relied a lot on the referrals from people that I've had contact with. I followed up each invitation with a request for other invitees that should be at the table. I think that's a great idea. In Virginia, we had success in asking identified participants to help lead us to their allied professionals who may be able to positively contribute to our project. That's wonderful. Yeah, I think that you kind of need to think about this as sort of like a Facebook effect, right? Every person you touch, you hope you invite 4 more people to be involved in this sort of thinking. And I think the only thing that I would add is if in your focus groups you're also hearing some negative comments about partners in the community or particular folks who aren't using services reliably, that too should be a trigger for you of a conversation and some listening that needs to take place. I think Nikki is still typing, but I would like to also open this up to Virginia. And I know, interesting that Nikki's in Montana's first challenge dovetails so nicely with yours, which the question we had for you all, which was what challenges you had in bringing a variety of agencies to the table. So folks from Virginia would like to chime in about the challenges you had. I think we can have both of those conversations at one time. So Nikki writes that other events in each location had an effect on attendance. For instance, there was a mental health training in Sidney, Montana that limited the presence of those providers. Yeah. And, I think sometimes we hope that dovetailing these sorts of activities would bring more people to the table, but it's really interesting that sometimes the people you get to hear from are limited by the logistics and the planning, and so you need to know your communities well and ask what sorts of conflicts are there. And we realize that has some inherent structural challenges for you guys because you want to get going. Don't want to always wait for those things. So Nikki adds, these were things I could not have anticipated. They were scheduled after my sessions. Right, and so the focus groups become a sort of an option, and these other mandatory things come in and bump you out of the way. I think it's a really, really good point. And so I think that I would, Kelly may have some things he'd like to add, but I would encourage you to think of listening sessions not as a one-off or one thing you have in your planning and then you've completed that, thank goodness you can move on to the next step in your planning, and rather this may turn out to be a rather recursive thing that periodically throughout the project you're in conversation and listening to folks, and hopefully there'll be enough buzz in your community and the buy-in from your partners that people will want to talk to you about the impact.
Yeah, and I just echo everything that Erin said, and I'd also note that, you know, there are logistical concerns as well. It's not like there's a great deal of people that work in this particular area. So you're dealing with a fairly narrow population of people who have the information that you want to gather. So that is exactly the same concern that Nikki is elucidating.
So Nikki is writing right now. We're going to take one more comment, I think, and then and maybe move on to hear a little bit about what experience and research tell us about overcoming some of these challenges, and then and absolutely we'll come back around for more conversation at other points throughout the webinar and at the end. Poor Nikki must feel like I'm making her be a really, really fast typer. Okay. Size was also important. I originally thought that 12 to 15 would be ideal, but my best sessions came from those sessions that were 6 to 10. People were more engaged and more comfortable. You know, I think that's a wonderful thing to learn about the communities you're working with, and I suspect folks have had varied experiences with this. I would have recommended 12 to 15 also. So that's really interesting, and you wonder if it's about community or the topic at hand, but I think we put that in the category of lessons learned, and certainly I would say that those of you planning sessions, I've had this experience, I don't know about others in the room, when you are coordinating or hosting a focus group and you hope for 15 and you see 5 trickle in and you begin to have an overwhelming sense of doom, and then realize that that may well turn out to be a really, really illuminating conversation, and so we want to keep the faith out there, I think. Kelly, you want to go ahead and keep moving?
Sure.
And those of you who want to add comments, I'm keeping track of them, and we will come back around for you, I promise.
And just one more quick comment is that 6 to 10 is approximately the same size that we use in our national curriculum. Anything bigger and you have trouble with communication, anything smaller and it becomes slightly too intimate. So 6 to 10 is actually the ideal sort of range. So what is a focus group? What is a listening session? Basically, a focus group listening session is a type of qualitative research. Qualitative research is a type of research used in social sciences and business to investigate phenomena that are not easily quantifiable or that involve inquiry into complex and ostensibly subjective decision-making where there may not be established models for inquiry. So these focus groups, these listening sessions, have actually been around for some time, but their use in peer-reviewed literature has been somewhat controversial, since they were commonly thought of as not as reliable as other data collection methods. Now, interestingly, the idea that focus groups are not reliable is actually not necessarily true. The information you can get from focus groups, that you can glean from focus groups, can be used as a basis to build models for later qualitative research. So, for example, if you have a new product, there may not be quantitative models which can be used to evaluate how people enjoy or use that product, so you can begin your research with a focus group to sort of identify issues and methods. On the other hand, you know, if we're thinking about sort of the things we're talking about, if you have community unrest, you know, let's say you have a particular community where there's a statistical high percentage of resisting arrest complaints, officer unlawful use of force complaints, you know, that can be caused by a number of things. It can signify distrust, it can signify fear of particular law enforcement officers that are assigned to that patrol beat, it might be cultural, it might be a training problem, so you may not know where to start in your system change process. So using a focus group to identify issues can help you build a gap analysis to identify system players. It can be very helpful. Population opinions. Focus groups can be used to clarify population opinions, particularly where you have populations which may not respond well to conventional methods. And we're going to talk about that in a few upcoming slides. We also remember that the data we're getting from focus groups is not really quantifiable. You know, when you want to quantify results, there are a variety of techniques you need. You can create a model which eliminates variables as much as possible, which provides, you know, all sorts of neat statistically valid data. The requirements, however, for good quantifiable results can sometimes restrict information which can be otherwise helpful. Classic example is if you have an illiterate population. One method for ensuring reliability is to have participants use a written survey, which eliminates bias in personal interviews. Obviously, if you have someone who's illiterate, they can't complete a survey, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the responses are irrelevant or unimportant. In fact, they may have a great deal to say. Like many subjects, they may have highly informative reasons for being illiterate. Maybe they're blind, maybe they're aphasic, maybe they have processing disorders. Qualitative data, briefly, can be roughly described as non-numerical data, but it's better described as kind of non-measurable data, like opinions, feelings, impressions, ideas, and particularly experiences. Why is experience so important? Because we look at the victim experience, particularly in this grant. The experience of victims with a particular system, with interaction with government agencies and people. Good example, is if I said to everyone, I'm going to give you a cookie at the end of this webinar, and then at the end of the webinar, I only gave a cookie to Nikki, all of you might be filled with feelings of wrath, envy, rage, jealousy, betrayal, but that's not necessarily easily quantifiable. I mean, when you say something, rate your anger on a scale of 1 to 10, you don't really get good data. But if you say something like, I'm so angry I can't even speak, or I'm so angry, I'm shaking, that provides a great deal more communication and information. You're able to recognize that just from your own human experience. So where and how have focus groups been used? Basically, focus groups are really useful in circumstances for capturing information that's non-traditional, where you're not concerned with quantifiable, statistically valid data. Quantitative analysis is one way to evaluate data, but it's not the only way. And in many respects, it leaves out kind of the human components to an investigation. And we are very concerned in this grant with the human components of system interaction. So, government. Classic example. The Department of Labor used focus groups to investigate what sort of responses they would get to changes in rules. DOJ used them in community-oriented policing services to identify practices in critical areas for training. In that sense, in DOJ's investigation, finding the perception of a community is a very sensitive inquiry. And it's not really going to be accurately reflected by a survey or analysis of raw data. DOJ's used them to discuss school mediation practices, regional civil rights issues. The Department of Agriculture has used them to learn about food safety campaigns. DHS has used them to solve employee and workforce problems. In education, recently, University of Louisville, Willamette used focus groups to discuss sexual assault, campus safety, antagonism between campus law enforcement and the student population. And in some respects, focus groups around sensitive community issues can also have an intrinsic benefit. You can target a community perceiving that their concerns are being heard. And the classic example is if you go to a doctor. If you go to a doctor and the doctor just sits there and asks you questions, and then he says, okay, here's your medication, well, you don't really feel like you went to the doctor, I mean, you sort of want the doctor to put his stethoscope on and interact with you in a more human way. There's a human experience to going to the doctor. So these focus groups can actually provide an intrinsic benefit by having the community perceive and legitimately, reasonably have their concerns be heard. It's a visual and substantive example that their concerns are being heard by someone that can do something. Business organizations use focus groups frequently for marketing, for product placement, and in some sense they can actually be even more cost-effective than traditional statistical analysis if you structure your group correctly. And what I'm talking about here is ensuring that the target demographics of your focus group accurately reflect the sample that you want to investigate. So, if you're using a focus group to determine whether a marketing campaign is effective for iPad sales, you want to interview a sample of possible buyers that has a relatively large amount of disposable income and are familiar with digital information. So that's kind of one particular salient in focus group analysis. You really have to target the members of your focus group very carefully. Now, education, business, government, what do we notice about all these activities? They're all highly sensitive. They contain information and involve activities which can generally be fairly damaging to the investigating agency, which can ruin community relations, which can go south in a number of ways. Now, focus groups allow you slightly more control over inquiry than you would otherwise have with a third-party based objective study, like a double-blind study. They also allow you to review data internally rather than through a third party. Now, for our purposes, in social science and medicine, focus groups have been used to investigate epidemiology, belief systems, for instance, a really good example, sexual behavior and sexual values. jury research, trafficking, and notably victim experience. So I mentioned victim experience before, and why is this important? When you're talking about a victim's experiences, it's very important to recognize that the majority of communication cannot be expressed in writing, especially communication regarding trauma. So focus groups can provide a medium to look at what someone is saying as well as how they are saying it. In fact, in the 2000 Victim Services Assessment, OVC particularly used focus groups to target populations which were difficult to express. So ESL populations, elderly populations, the mentally ill and disabled populations, populations that traditionally are not expressed well in written surveys or statistical data because that data is difficult to acquire using traditional methods. So really good example. I'm sure some of you may have reviewed transcripts, really fun activity if any of you have ever reviewed a transcript. I had a case once, a child sexual abuse case, where we had a child victim in a sex abuse trial who was testifying. And significant trauma with this victim. She was actually testifying under a blanket, and they were asking her yes and no questions, and she was responding yes and no. But when she responded, she'd have this almost haunting, sobbing, drawn-out yes, no, almost, and you could hear the tremolo in her voice. So there's definitely a great deal of emotional power that can be conveyed to signify this victim's trauma and this victim's experience, but not expressed at all on a written transcript. All you get is the word yes, no. I mean, how do you convey victim was highly emotional and drawing out her words on a written transcript? It's almost impossible to convey. But if you're sitting there listening to it and seeing this victim testify, it's an entirely different medium of communication. You get a whole area of data that you wouldn't necessarily get. And really, that's just one of the reasons why focus groups are effective. You get a broad range of inquiry. Surveys, standardized tests can be difficult at reading individual context and explanation. Another good example, the MMPI. I'm sure all of you have seen the MMPI results or even gone through an MMPI. Oh, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. Big, long psychological inventory. I think it's 500 questions, Carly? Or
I think it's closer to 300.
300 questions. If you have a victim who is paranoid, if you have a victim who is being victimized by stalking, where her abuser is following her on Facebook and stalking her where she goes to work and stalking her where she lives and driving past her apartment, the MMPI asks questions like, do you think someone's following you? Do you think someone's watching you? Do you think someone's going to hurt you? So the MMPI, in its glory, will think that this victim is paranoid. It'll come out with a result that says it's paranoid. Now, as one of our judges in residence said, I'm not paranoid if it's true. All that information you'd get from context. And context is a major part of understanding a victim's experience, particularly a population's experience with a particular system. A client can get excellent health care at a hospital, really good health care. But if she's treated like a second-class citizen by staff, her experience is not going to line up with what the system perceives as a good outcome. So without understanding the context of decision-making, it becomes difficult to see the gaps in implementation. There are a number of reasons that people may not seek out mental health treatment, for instance. Social stigma, cultural stigma, how mental health is viewed in the community, and whether or not they feel comfortable interacting with the mental health system itself. All that information you get from context. Really another just good example from Imperial County, where I used to work on the border. We don't generally get a lot of information from law enforcement responses. Why? Because in many cases you have a very large undocumented immigrant population because of the transient border, and the primary responding agency in Imperial County tends to be Border Patrol. So victims don't necessarily want to open up and address their concerns with the local Border Patrol agent. Survey investigations also can tend to reflect a particular time period because of the nature of question design, meaning that it's difficult to pin down an experience within a specific period of time. So they may say something like, within the last 6 months or the last year. But if you're looking at a community's experience with a particular phenomenon, with for instance, their interaction with a system, you may actually want to look at the life course experience with a given system. Or survey questions can actually be overbroad. You know, if you ask someone, have you experienced trauma in the past 30 days, you can look back over the past 30 days to see what sort of things have caused that trauma. On the other hand, if you ask someone, have you experienced trauma over the past 6 months, you may have multiple incidents, the accumulation of trauma, the effects of any intervention, all of which complicate looking at causation. So it doesn't really make a survey a good tool for looking at that experience. Focus groups also allow for different response types. You know, some topics can be difficult to cover in one-on-one interviews. Also, many communities, as we discussed, don't necessarily respond well to surveys or traditional investigations, specifically with regard to indigenous populations. The backdrop to federal government involvement with indigenous populations in the United States has not been particularly helpful, or for that matter, well received. You know, many Native American communities are characterized by a very strong emphasis on interpersonal relations, mutual respect, and ritualistic examples of equal footing. So a person instructing someone to take a survey is not really equal footing, nor is an investigator going into a tribe and saying, hey, we need to know this about you, or even someone conducting a case analysis, you know, saying, let's look through all of your law enforcement cases and let's review what you did wrong. That has a very significant error of judgment to it. So some population samples don't necessarily respond well to surveys, to investigations, or to traditional investigations. You know, if you want to keep going down that road, some communities can actually be antagonistic or resent the agency conducting the focus group, so you can end up with a bigger problem than when you started with. And finally, ritualistically, people don't necessarily like the idea of other people making decisions about their community without some form of personal interaction. So I mentioned going to a doctor, you know, and we can expand that to the idea of building a hospital. You know, if a government is making a decision about building a hospital in a particular area, there is some ritualistic component to the community saying, this is why we need this hospital. This is the illness we've suffered. These are the injuries we've suffered. And a focus group can, again, provide an intrinsic benefit rather than a government agency saying, well, we looked through all your law enforcement reports, we looked through your injury reports, and we think statistically it's a good idea to build a hospital here. The community doesn't really feel like they've had a say in that decision-making process. So focus groups also have the added advantage of stimulating new ideas and concepts. This particular quote is actually from an article entitled Focus Groups as Alternative Research Practice, and it deals with trans-migrants in Indonesia. Basically, it argues that focus groups can be very helpful because sometimes participants correct each other. They augment information, and you don't just get a collection of individual perspectives like you'd get from an individual interview. You get one perspective, which can be reflective of the group. And this can be very helpful because it can kind of collapse data into one big chunk. You know, it can simplify data collection. Thinking in a group environment where the discussion is not structured can actually be quite fruitful. It can give way to new vantage points on research. It can stimulate new analysis. It can provide suggestions for further investigation. And really for a gap analysis, you know, if you're looking at a group mapping or a gap analysis, it can concentrate intervention, you know, much like therapeutic intervention. For those of you who have ever done MDST meetings, or multidisciplinary meetings where we talk about cases, when I was a public defender, some of the best results we got was where we just met in court prior to a case going on, and we said, social worker, come here, therapist, come here, doctor, come here, and the judge and the attorneys, and we all just sat there and talked about the case and collapsed it and analyzed it and had this very fruitful group discussion. And those are great. Those are really excellent ways of getting good data. And when you're dealing with non-Western communities, this can be very interesting. Because in Western communities, there is a tendency to think in terms of individualistic perspectives, you know, which is associated with classical Western upbringing. East Asian, Southeast Asian cultures, indigenous perspectives, there's a very strong emphasis on decision-making which takes into account the effect on other people and on the group, particularly close family members in societal perception. So if you're approaching a topic from a perspective of merely providing enough information to allow someone to make a Western-style kind of cost-benefit analysis, this can be seen very differently by different cultures. And finally, focus groups are really effective because they're responsive to participants. Some of you may have sat through a forensic interview, a child forensic interview for sexual assault. And for those of you who have not sat through one of these forensic interviews, basically there's an extended prep process, where you're talking to the subject about these are the questions I'm going to ask you. If you're not certain, can you let me know? If you don't understand something, can you let me know? If I'm saying something incorrectly, you can correct me. So if you prep the survivor correctly, you can go backwards, forwards, you can focus on a specific issue, you can ask for more detail, you can respond to the information you gather. And this idea of question and response and targeted response is very important for focus groups. Rather than using sort of like a structured checklist interview format that you see in like a law enforcement police report where you're saying, okay, does a victim or a suspect have these particular characteristics? Like, is she crying? Is she sobbing? Are there scratches? Are there bruises? A responsive focus group format allows you to target the inquiry. Actually, if you're using sort of that targeted checklist approach, it can actually be detrimental because to the person who is answering the questions, it seems like you're not really connecting with them. This targeted response allows you to take inquiry into areas where you may not have planned. A survey response can reveal something important, but you can't shift the focus of your inquiry into a whole different area because there's really no medium for communication in the survey. Likewise, passive data collection, like case reviews, can reveal something important but contain additional information. It can allow you to determine why a particular piece of information is important to participants. And finally, these are really efficient. It allows you to maximize the facilitator time by honing in on information you need and acquiring a great deal of information in a short amount of time. So, should you look at how a focus group is executed as well as the information you get? And I'll turn it over to Erin for a moment so she can collect some answers.
Yeah, so this is one of those times where I actually am particularly interested in your thoughts about format and context. As Kelly has, I think, done a really nice job of explaining, the context is really, really important. And so if you don't have an opinion right now about whether or not you should be looking at how the focus group is executed as well as the information you get, perhaps you could tell me about a time when context really mattered in terms of the efficacy of a listening session or a focus group you've done in the past. Great. Nikki says, I think so. Are you talking about location things? Yeah, I think location is one sense of context in which it's been really important. So Nikki, did you have a location that seemed to determine the quality or content of the feedback you got? Most of our sessions were held in public libraries or other communal locations. I think that increased the level of comfort. I'm sure that it did for some folks. And then I wonder, Nikki or others, if you have thoughts, if they had not been professionals or service providers, whether or not that would have had some impact on the kind of information or the kind of people who would come in those public spaces, for better or worse. I don't actually have an opinion about that so much as I would posit that it might have been, it's an important question to always ask. I'm also interested in whether or not, I think location is one way to think about this, but the context might also, to kind of pull back to some of the information Kelly was sharing, whether or not you've done has anybody done any information gathering with service providers outside of focus groups? Have you done surveys or structured interviews or anything like that? Nikki says, yes, for the better. If these would have been held in government buildings, I think it would change the kind of impression people have about the sessions, right? You put them in a kind of a democratic setting. That's really cool. That's nice. A couple people talking, and I've laid out a couple of questions there, so I'll do my best field the answer and attach it to the right question. And if I don't, we'll just call it a lark, huh? I'd love to hear from anybody, too, who maybe has learned from a negative experience. Have you ever sent out a survey and got a lot of information and realized it was not what you needed? Or had a focus group where the questions didn't quite work for you and it would have been better in a survey or an interview? So Nikki says, our surveys will be informed by the data we gather at the listening sessions. That's great. Lori says, I have done focus groups for service providers, public health nurses, and home visitors, and they were done on-site at the health department over lunch. I think that's a really good way to go to link back to some of our how do you capture your audience questions we had first. And I suspect that in that setting there was a lot of the kind of synergy that Kelly described where people clarify, challenge, push back, and augment their stories because they're among colleagues. Otherwise, I don't think they would have been well attended. I think that's right. I mean, I think we've all had that experience when you're very close to doing email at your desk and a friend from work says, I'm going to go to this thing. Why don't you come with me? Huh? Looks like Nancy is typing. I'd like to hang on for just a second if you don't mind, Kelly.
Sure.
Nancy says, I've done lots of surveys and always have additional questions that I wish I had put into the survey. Focus groups give that follow-up opportunity. Absolutely. So, you know, I think that one of the lessons we might learn from these beginning phases of the site-based work is the varieties of information that we get. One side, it sounds like, is going to be doing surveys followed by focus groups, and it sounds like in Montana, focus groups are going to be followed by surveys. And I suspect that the best advice from our TA team will be that you keep doing that back and forth as we impact practice and public information about this. But that's really, really helpful. And I think Kelly may have some helpful things to tell us about how we might structure this to anticipate some of this sort of interplay.
So basically, you know, the question is, do you look at context? And the answer, we think, is yes. And here's why. You know, many of us have worked in the criminal justice system and have had court interaction. And the court system, the legal system, police reports, law enforcement, you know, in the words of one of our judges in residence, we tend to focus very acutely on what happened at a particular date, at a particular time, you know, whether or not this particular incident happened, because that's the way that the legal system's response has always been structured, a reaction to a particular incident, rather than looking at, you know, from a more holistic standpoint, the idea of what is going on in the greater span of things, the context of a person's experience or reaction to a particular system. So the question is, how do you look at context? Now I'm going to skip forward one slide and just do this slide first, so we can take a look at contextual framework. This is a breakdown. It's written by a professor named Vicek out of Budapest on how to look at focus groups contextually. An important component to analyzing data from focus groups is actually analyzing the context of the discussion. You know, it's especially important for native focus groups because of the particular importance on cultural communication. You know, unlike quantitative data collection where you attempt to screen out this sort of information, in a focus group, this sort of information can actually be very helpful. So Professor Vicek created this framework for analyzing this sort of data, which kind of gives you a model for looking at the context environment that a conversation takes place. Now, Nikki mentioned libraries. Very good example of interaction. The atmosphere, the dominance of research. You know, the focus group in Montana is obviously going to have a different environment than a focus group conducted in a federal prison or in the context of a large dispute. You know, if you're doing this, for instance, focus group in a courtroom, you know, that's going to create an entirely different vibe, specifically for people who are not familiar with courtrooms. Courtrooms are scary places. You know, one of the things I used to tell my interns is that this is where we go for work. This is where other people go because they've been hurt or they've been victimized. So Where you're holding this focus group is very important. What is the interaction of the facilitator with the focus group participants? We also look at the characteristics of the participants. Are the participants under stress? Are they displaying any emotionality, like that victim we described in the sex abuse trial? If you're doing a focus group on sexual assault and you have a survivor, you're probably going to have some level of emotion to the discussion, which can inhibit conversation or spark conversation. So for instance, sometimes you have a survivor disclose her own abuse, and then you have another participant validate her experience. And that actually can spark more conversation, and that's important to look at when you're conducting the focus group. What's the educational level of participants? You have someone with a PhD and someone who, for instance, is a high school graduate. Are they using non-native language? Look at your moderator. What's the moderator's style, control, relative power? What's their assumed role? Being a moderator or a facilitator for a focus group, and I kind of use the term interchangeably, is kind of dicey. Nikki did a wonderful job in the focus group we saw in Montana, especially sometimes if your moderator is one of these three professions: doctor, lawyer, or cop. Those are three very authoritarian professions, and they connote a specific role in society as well as a specific type of interaction with a person. So being a moderator for a focus group, you want to avoid any sort of implied amount of authority which changes the shape of the conversation. Really good example. In the National Judicial Training on Domestic Violence, we have facilitators in small groups, and those facilitators are always judges because we train judges. So whenever we are talking in a small group table, the only people at that table are judges. No lawyers, no other non-lawyer faculty, no therapists, no mental health experts. It's all judges. And the reason is judges feel more comfortable talking about their own experience confronting domestic violence with other judges. So you have to look at both what the participant reaction is to the moderator as well as how the moderator is going to interact with the participants. You look at the environment. Is it peaceful? Is it separate? Is it busy? Is it secluded? Is it hostile? Is it neutral territory like a library? Also, be aware of subtle barriers. Elevation of the moderator, classroom-like setting. One of the experiments I used to do when I taught college was I used to have an older student go up to the front of the classroom and just start saying hello to the students as they came in and see how many of them would think that he was the professor simply because he was just standing in the same place that the professor was. So be aware of classroom-like settings. In addition, look at size, spacing, and obviously time. Time is going to influence questions, particularly if there are cultural aspects surrounding time. When I was in Imperial County, which is in the Utah Desert, a lot of work and communication was actually done at night because it's simply too hot to do things during the day. So the town kind of came alive at nighttime, and people usually slept during the late afternoon. So be mindful of local variation. And finally, you look at content. Certain topics can be sensitive. Children, assault, trauma, mental health, all of these are all hot-button issues which raise a significant amount of emotion in people, particularly if they have touched the court system or have had a negative experience with law enforcement. So be very aware of the emotionality involved in these conversations. Also from service providers themselves. So cops, social workers, lawyers, judges. These are people that may have experienced secondary trauma and have their own emotional response. Okay, briefly, I just want to go back to one previous slide called EMIC and EDIC data. And that's looking at the greater structure of the focus group itself. EMIC data is data which originally comes from the respondents. It's internal to the focus group. It originates out of the focus group. This is the sort of data you want if you are looking at investigation in a particular area or region. This is the sort of data which is original to the focus groups. ETIC data, ETIC, is imposed by the research or inquiring agency from outside of the group. And this is the data seen through the lens of our own culture. So it's not really arrived at organically. If you want to think about it that way, even though some amount of ETIC data has to be imposed on participants to govern and facilitate the topic area, you want to limit the amount of stuff you are telling participants which color their own responses. You want to have good, original responses which are arrived at organically by the focus group participants themselves. So, focus groups barriers. Things can go south in focus groups, and these tend to be two big areas. The first is group polarization. By the way, has anyone watched The Big Bang Theory? If you can't read the caption, it says, if you don't mind, I'd like to stop listening to you, and now I'd like to start talking. And one of the first problems is group polarization, or radicalization of viewpoints in group discussion. There is some research that points to something called group polarization. Basically, this is participant viewpoints radicalizing, not in the sense of becoming political, but by becoming more extreme or more riskier. And some of that is an affirmation of other people holding positions similar to yours and reinforcing what was originally more fragile internal decision-making about something. So for anyone who's ever done a voir dire, on a jury, if you're asking someone, hey, have you ever had a bad experience with law enforcement? And someone says, well, yeah, I had a bad experience with law enforcement. You may get 3 other respondents and then say the same thing. They're like, oh, yeah, you know what? I did too. Oh, yeah, you're right. I also had a bad experience with law enforcement. So you can have an internal affirmation, basically, of someone's feelings regarding a particular experience, even though if you were talking to them individually, they may not necessarily state that experience that strongly. So there's a slight chance that viewpoints expressed may be stronger than an individual participant's actual feeling on the subject. Second big problem, self-disclosure, self-censoring. There is also some research that points out that you might get better disclosures in group discussion because of a greater sense of anonymity. Edward Fern, wrote a book called Advanced Focus Group Research, 2001. But I'm not certain that research accounted for cultural differences in rural tribal communities. So that particular idea, the idea that you're going to get more disclosures because there's a sense of anonymity, that may work in like New York, where you don't necessarily know the person that you're engaged in a focus group with. But in the very small communities and rural environments, that may not happen because you simply don't have that anonymity. And you also consider the fact that, DV, child welfare, mental health, trauma, these are people who see each other every day sometimes. I mean, they're in the same court, they're working in the same environment, they're dealing with the same sort of victims and families. So you may not necessarily have that amount of anonymity that you would otherwise have in a marketing focus group. And lastly, you have the idea of intimate disclosures. And there is some level of reciprocity between people who disclose intimate information. Usually you'll get something like, you have someone disclose abuse, and then you have another participant validate that disclosure by disclosing her own abuse, saying, you know what, that also happened to me, or that happened to my daughter, or that happened to my uncle. And obviously here, when you're speaking about trauma and victimization, a great deal of information is intimate in any sense. So there's some sort of balancing or quality in this disclosures which can be socially driven. I share vulnerable information with you, you also share vulnerable information with me. The problem is you get too many of those, it can kind of shut the conversation down. If you have 3 people disclose sexual victimization, it definitely creates a different vibe for your focus group that you originally wanted to have as a vibrant, thriving discussion. In the same vein, you may have people who conceal information to portray themselves favorably, particularly if you have political positions and appearances which may be politically important. So if you have, for instance, county council in a focus group and you also have the head of DSS in a focus group, you're going to have slightly different responses because that person is also aware of what their statements will have upon the impressions of county council. So it's very important to also discuss the confidentiality inherent in a focus group and the idea that you want valid responses. The classic situation here is that you have a supervisor and an employee. As in, an employee is not going to want to disclose things that he says about his supervisor which he may not find agreeable, and a supervisor is not going to say, God, I really think that employee stinks. It's just not going to happen. Again, rural environments tend to be smaller, more interconnected, and the relationship with service providers, also especially among LGBT populations, can be very tenuous. So something to keep in mind. So how do you make a focus group culturally responsive?
And this is a question for you all. And so I would ask, as you're sort of typing some responses for us, not only if you if you have strategies in mind for how you make a focus group culturally responsive, that would be great. But also if you could make any comments on why it's important.
You will get extra points if you recognize where this image is from. This is the meeting of Captain Kirk with the Klingon delegation in Star Trek for the Undiscovered Countries.
Really? I was going to say an NCJ-SCJ staff meeting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Which one are you? Captain Kirk.
Oh, I'm getting coffee. I'm not there. I would just add, while people are sort of thinking and typing, that sometimes it's very easy and distracting to get caught up in the logistics of planning focus groups and getting approval and getting access to certain communities or getting enough people to the table, and to remind you that it's just so fundamentally important, because we can't be planning good systems change and good system coordination and communication and collaboration if we're not also listening. Oh my goodness, Julie, only one female in the delegation. Captain Kirk needs to embrace gender diversity. Agreed. So I think if all of you, during the evaluation, if you could make sure that you use Kelly by name when you're judging the quality of the graphics, that would be helpful to us at the council.
It's really good.
So do folks have any thoughts, actually, about making culturally responsive focus groups or listening sessions, and why that matters to you in this moment? And now Julie says Kelly rocks. She just wanted it in writing, Kelly. And if that is too large a question for you all, I guess I would ask as a little follow-up, what sorts of things can you do structurally or in your planning or in your facilitation to make sure the communities and cultures that your states are most responsive to, that you're listening and that you're attending to their needs? We have to be all kidding aside, we have to be very cognizant of balancing gender, race, and ethnicity. I think that's right, Julie, and it was a very graceful introduction to the topic. Yeah, I think that's right, both in terms of the makeup of the group and in whatever we can do around facilitation and hosting. That you want to see that there's been some thought about being inclusive, and that these groups represent the whole community. I know that Nikki and Bethany were both typing, so I think we'll wait for their comments before we move on. Keep it moving, and Nikki, we'll come back around for your comment, I promise. We have a couple other folks who made some helpful comments to us that we want to address at the end of the webinar too.
Okay, so I wanted to talk briefly about cultural diversity, specifically in the context of Native populations, and I'm going to speed through some of these slides, but I did want to mention one example, which is working with senior members of a tribal population. The following two quotes are actually from a study conducted by June Strickland on Northwest Indian tribal populations, and again, it sort of discusses how we have to think about using these focus groups in the context of non-Western traditions. Elders. Knowing that respected elders will speak at the end of a session after others have spoken is crucial, because the moderator has to leave time at the end for elders to speak. Also, if you have a facilitator and you're saying, hey, can you talk up? Or, hey, can you talk about this? That's kind of confrontational and rude and aggressive, and it's culturally inappropriate, and it's going to shut down the conversation. Another example that we want to look at, especially with indigenous focus groups, is the idea of harmony. Interpersonal relations, social relations are very important in many indigenous populations. So the following two quotes are actually from a study called Psychological Wellbeing Asian Style, the perspective of Thai elders, and it's actually kind of interesting, the dovetailing of Southeast Asian cultural tradition and indigenous American tradition. In the context of local community focus groups, you have to keep in mind that, one, when you finish the focus group, all these people have to go home and live with each other. Many of them are neighbors. So there's going to be a sense of wanting to keep the peace. You know, you're not going to have someone say, well, that person did this and this other person did this, even between service providers and government agencies. They may put a particular emphasis on harmony, on not offending others. So this is something to keep in mind if your facilitator is getting frustrated with everyone agreeing with each other, and the consent, you know, keeping in mind that the consensus can actually be culturally driven and polite. In this particular study, they were looking at elderly Thai adults, looking at what made them happy, what their values were, what they considered important, and the chief thing they said was, the thing that's most important is harmony, you know, getting along with everyone. So you have to think about this value, the emphasis that a population may place on this value in the context of analyzing focus group discussions, where someone may feel like they need to self-censor because they don't want to offend the other person. Okay, then you have non-responsive groups. This is groups where no one really talks. A traditional way of ensuring that we have full participation begins with screening candidates that are interested in focus groups, setting egalitarian ground rules which encourage participation, promoting active listening, and stacking, you know, stacking response speakers, as in kind of going up to some, which is basically what I did with Nikki, where I told her about a week in advance, hey, by the way, we're going to ask you a question, you might want to have something to say, or you might want to mention this, that, or the other. So you're stacking a response speaker, and that can break down some of the, you know, cultural barriers to voicing information. However, keep in mind that many of these techniques can be viewed as aggressive or culturally inappropriate, you know. It can also be very easy for a facilitator to adopt a teacher-student role and begin lecturing if you're trying to force discussion, or reframe a question in a way which actually won't help you. If there is food, if you are using food, try to schedule exciting topics or topics which you know will generate interest after lunch. Most people perk up at the beginning of a session and towards the end of a session. Mid-morning, late afternoon, generally those are problematic times universally for focus groups, for large group discussions. Those statistically are where we structure our segments in national curriculum where we expect the least response. Domineering participants. What do you do if you get a domineering participant? This depends. This depends. In some situations, you may get a domineering participant who happens to be a senior member or someone who is culturally important. And in that case, it's very important to trust your facilitator and prepare your facilitator for the expectation that in some situations you may not be able to confront, as you would in a Western focus group or a traditional focus group, the idea that someone is being domineering. There generally is a structured decision-making process that we go through with some of our facilitators where we say, okay, you can try talking to that person alone outside of the focus group. You can try taking a break. You can try talking to someone else and diverting the conversation. You can try some deviation techniques. In general, direct confrontation in a focus group is not a good idea, you know, especially because many of us in criminal justice, many of us in domestic violence are trained on the Duluth method, and we kind of trapeze into confrontation very easily. Our sense of confrontation, particularly with those who've dealt with suspects, defendants, in a prosecutorial environment or in custodial environments, is very easy to get into. We get into it much easier than other people. So it's important to keep that in mind. You want to try and avoid direct confrontation as much as possible. If you simply have a participant who is dominating the group, you may have to conduct another focus group. You know, that is probably the more efficient way of doing it, rather than burning a bridge with that particular participant and polarizing the rest of that focus group against someone that might be particularly important in that community.
And Kelly, there was a mention also of going in with a seating chart as a way in which to balance some of these power differentials. And I think, you know, if you know who is coming to your focus group, that's sometimes a really, really wise thing to do. If that's not all focus groups are you going to have known entities to you, but if you do have that kind of thing, then I would suggest you think very thoughtfully about how to put powerful people and who they're sitting next to. And if There are also people who you know will have side conversations, and you know who are going to be shy, and those might be people you want to keep in the facilitator's clear view. And to be thoughtful about that, I think is a great point.
I love to use table tents, and I like to use them for two reasons. One, a person comes into a focus group and sees a table tent, they're like, oh, neat, my name, and it has their position, and it feels validating. They feel important. Second, ulterior sneaky motive is you get to tell people where to sit. Okay, especially if you put the focus groups out where someone says, okay, this is where I sit, this is my table tent, oh, you're in group 1, you're in group 3, you're over here, you're on the other side of the table. So they'll sit where their table tent is assigned. That's a sneaky rule. And that's just a very silly technique you can use, if you have to structure your participants in a particular area. Generally, if you have close interacting agencies with each other, you either want to have them in separate focus groups or you want them away from each other. Otherwise, those two participants will form a block because they won't want to pick the other off.
Which goes to this other comment we have about focus groups with managers and line staff and having separate groups with them so that you don't have to put somebody in an uncomfortable position where they have to speak when you want them to speak honestly and their manager is sitting next to them. That's not likely to be very effective, but it puts the burden of work back on the organizers, that they listen in different constellations.
Yeah, and I actually just did a training out in El Centro where we had a variety of people from different ranges. And so we put like level 1 line workers in one table, level 2 workers at another table, and then at the top table, I don't want to say top, but at the far table, we put administrators, supervisors, attorneys, judges. Also, it's very difficult for a judge to speak openly in an environment with non-judges because of ethical barriers. Particularly if you have quasi-judicial agencies like ALJs, administrative law judges, justices of the peace. It's very, very difficult for them ethically, and it puts them in a very awkward position because they can't really voice their concerns openly. In that situation, it's better to have them in a group of judges or an internal confidential focus group or an anonymous focus group. Okay, other barriers, resource limitations, untrained facilitators, conflicts between participants, breaches of confidentiality, shills. Yeah, sometimes you do get shills. You get people who may want to come to the focus group for the free food. Obviously, you want to ensure that you don't have those people in your focus group. Resource limitations, untrained facilitators, those are things which are kind of easy fixes. Conflicts between participants, insufficient screening, you fix that with good screening, good investigation. And sometimes investigation is done really good on the ground by simply asking, hey, do you get along with this person? Does this person get along with this person? Where should I sit people? And in that sense, be very careful to work with your tribal liaison or your regional liaison. So how do you conduct an effective focus group?
Bring dogs.
Yeah, bring dogs. Dogs help. But honestly, you conduct an effective focus group by first looking at what are the goals, what sort of data am I looking for, by planning it out. When we do our curriculum training, we go through a process called ILED. And ILED basically front loads the idea of structuring a discussion. The idea that you want to start with what you want to get out of the discussion. You want to start then by structuring the discussion based on the information you are looking to get, and then writing the questions and activities that you want to do. You don't start by saying, wow, this is a really good learning activity, this is a really good question, this is a really good inquiry, I want to start with that, because that actually is the wrong way to start with. It puts all of the emphasis on the question, which can go south. If you structure your focus group based on the goals of the focus group and the information that you're looking at, it makes it malleable and responsive enough to respond to different areas of information which may come up. Look at the questions that you are going to ask, as in, can you revisit the original question? What sort of data am I looking for? What is my end goal? Consider the participants and try to eliminate redundancy. Well, what do you think about that? Well, that's interesting. What do you think about that? Well, that's really interesting. What do you think about that? That can create a lot of fatigue. It can create a lot of redundancy. You may get a lot of people saying the same thing. Try to ask a participant different questions in different manners so that they have a chance to cater the responses with different information. Remember cultural competence. Oh, and if you have any experience in court, don't cross-examine. And when I say cross-examine, as in use leading questions. When you say that, what you meant is your interaction with the agency means X. Oh, basically, try to use open-ended questions, broad questions, which begin with inquiries: how, what, where, when, why, how do you feel, what was your experience? So it empowers the participant that is responding to convey his own information. And finally, what we want to look at is who's facilitating. Use excellent trained facilitators and moderators. Make sure that you prep them, train them, support them on both the region and the culture. And when we speak about culture, not just indigenous ethnic culture, but the culture of the region and the community. The culture of lawyering and law enforcement in that particular community can vary between region and region. You're going to conduct a focus group with 9 law enforcement officers very differently than you would conduct a focus group with 9 trauma counselors. So there is a particular strategic emphasis on prepping your facilitator to get the best level of response. And finally, I just want to point this out. And this is a quote from Brian McGill, which basically says, you know, one of the most sincere forms of respect in everything, in all of the focus groups you do, should be underscored by the idea of respect. Because these are the folks who are really interacting with victims, is actually listening to what another person has to say. So listen to their responses and respond. You know, respond based on what a person is saying. Don't just go to the next question, all right? Validate that person's response, acknowledge it, say thank you for giving me this information, and cater your response based on what someone has said. In fact, it's always a good idea to allude to what a prior respondent said in another question. Like Carlene has said, Carrie, can you address something that happened in your agency? Because that respondent, the original respondent, then feels very validated because she knows that you've listened to what she had to say. Does anyone have any questions?
Or comments? So you have your TA team here happy to provide any guidance around any of these strategies, forming of questions, thinking through what sort of format would be best for what kinds of data. And we just really encourage you to call us, and we're happy to help you think through these things, help you identify good facilitators, help you identify when focus groups and surveys may be the most useful given the juncture you're at. You know, I think we're putting a lot of emphasis right now on focus groups that would help in resource mapping and sort of needs assessment, because that's where we are on the project, but there's certainly a place for these sorts of conversations later on when you'll want different kinds of information about how to braid agencies or provide services. And so we kind of encourage you, as you may have picked up, to take this process really, really seriously as an option that's available to you throughout the life of the project.
Thank you. And if there's no further questions, then thank you for coming to this webinar. We really appreciate all your time.
And we're going to go ahead, as we end the webinar, you should have automatic access to a survey about your technical assistance needs. It looks like Nikki is actually asking a question or typing a response. Oh, it was just a thank you. Just excellent manners. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Should I end it?
We're going to go ahead and end the meeting now, and we appreciate all of your presence.
Yeah. Okay. Oh.